Hello everybody, it's Hater. Welcome back to another Destiny 2 build video. And today we're going to be breaking down how to solo flawless the brand new Duality dungeon for your Warlock. This video is going to be split up into two different halves. The first half is going to be me breaking down the build itself, go over the aspects, the fragments, the weapons we're using, and then go into my armor and break down the mods we'll be using in the build. As for the second half of the video, it'll be me guiding you guys through each encounter and go over what will be changing in the loadout, the strategy for the encounter, and some tips to make your life a lot easier. I also timestamped each section of this video, so if you ever want to jump to a specific part, maybe you missed something, you have the access of doing so. Now that we got that out of the way, let's get into the video. And to start off for the build that we'll be using, it is Infinite Fusion Grenades. Now, if you're not familiar with Infinite Fusion Grenades, this is being used quite often because of the exotic chess piece Starfire Protocol. I made two separate videos explaining this build in depth, and the one that is the most updated will be down in the description if you're interested in it. But to put it simple, Starfire Protocol's exotic perk is going to give you 2 fusion grenades. When you deal empowered weapon damage inside of both your Empowering Rift and your Well of Radiance, that is going to refund energy back into your fusion grenades. And then the final kicker is that whenever you get a kill with your fusion grenades, it will completely refund your rift's energy. This is going to act as our foundation for the entire build. Solar 3.0 did a great job further enhancing this, because when we utilize the Touch of Flame aspect, it's now going to cause those fusion grenades to explode twice. And then because of the new reworked Scorch and Ignition effect, it will now also apply Scorch stacks to enemies whenever we hit them with them. Meaning every time that we throw 2 fusion grenades, it's going to cause an enemy to ignite and explode for a 3rd time. Not only will this act as our single target DPS, but it will also make clearing adds in the dungeon a lot easier. For the actual subclass itself, we're going to be using both Well of Radiance and Empowering Rift as not only our damage sources, but our panic buttons to stay alive. Whenever we need to deal a lot of DPS, Well of Radiance is going to be used, and then whenever we need HP or cycle out our abilities, Empowering Rift combined with the mod Classy Restoration will be used. For the aspects, as we talked about earlier, Touch of Flame is going to be your main aspect. It allows your fusion grenades to explode twice. As for the other aspect, this pretty much comes down to preference. I prefer using Icarus Dash so that I can move around the encounters much more easily. It'll also now give us a burst of healing from Cure whenever we get multiple kills inside of the air. But during some of the single target encounters, you can mess around with Heat Rises, because it now also gives you healing whenever you consume your grenades. In a very heavily focused grenade build, having a heal on demand like this is not a bad idea. It will also help you cycle out your melee energy whenever you're in the air. Moving now down onto the fragments, starting from the left, we're going to be using Ember of Empyrean. This is going to allow our solar weapons or ability final blows, aka our fusion grenades, to extend the duration of both restoration and radiant buffs. Since we're using both Classy Restoration and Ember of Torches in this build, this is going to allow us to have constant uptime for both 25% weapon damage and healing. Moving to the next fragment, we'll be using Ember of Ashes. This is going to cause all of our abilities to apply more Scorch stacks when they apply Scorch stacks, meaning in the long run, it's easier to cause an enemy to ignite, and it's also going to make them take more damage much more often. For the next fragment, as I mentioned a moment ago, Ember of Torches. This is going to cause our melee ability to give us the radiant buff every single time we hit an enemy with it. This just means we have 25% more weapon damage until it runs out. Like I mentioned earlier, Ember of Empyrean is going to extend that every time we get kills with solar weapons or our solar abilities. Extremely useful in the downtime when we're not using our Empowering Rift or our Well of Radiance. And then the final fragment is Ember of Char. This is going to cause any solar ignition we create to spread Scorch to nearby enemies. This is just super useful because at any moment in time that we're in the dungeon and we cause an enemy to ignite, it'll spread the burn effect around it, making ad clear much easier. Now that we've gone over the aspects and fragments, let's talk about weapons we're bringing into this dungeon. And I'm going to be keeping this as brief as possible, but you're going to need a few things. One, you're going to need Witherhoard. Witherhoard is going to be your star weapon in the entire build. You apply it to an enemy, that DOT effect it applies synergizes with Starfire Protocol, and then gives you infinite fusion grenades. Not only that, but it is also a top tier ad clear weapon. You have to deal with a bunch of ads very quickly. An example of this is in the second encounter with the 3 bosses, the first encounter with Gahlran, and even the final encounter with Caiatl. You can shoot Witherhoard at the ground or at the target and deal with them very efficiently. If you don't happen to have Witherhoard, which I recommend you do, you could just use Anarchy instead and get the same results, but at the cost of your heavy weapon. Now moving on to your next weapon, this is going to be your general primary ammo weapon. An example of something I can recommend is the one I used in the background for this video, my funnel web with perpetual motion and frenzy. At the time, I was using this mostly as a budget weapon because I didn't have a callus mini tool. But realistically, you don't need to shoot for the moon for something very specific. You just want something that has high fire rate and is very efficient at taking care of ads. However, something that I still can recommend to make your life a lot easier is a weapon with incandescent. This perk is going to make it where your weapon will scorch nearby enemies after killing one. Think of it as Ember of Char, but for your weapon. It causes enemies to burn, and if you kill enough, it'll cause them to ignite and spread the burn even further. Currently, there are 4 primary ammo weapons that can roll this perk. The one that I recommend the most that you bring into this dungeon is a callus mini tool. Just like all of the reprised Season of the Opulence gear, this is going to come from containment. Now, you don't have to farm out the red borders and craft this weapon. Any decent roll with incandescent will do much better than not having the weapon in the first place. If you're not a fan of the callus mini tool though, there are still 3 other options you can choose from. The Strident Whistle Bow from Vanguard Strikes, the Staccato Scout Rifle from the Whirlpool, and Drang Baroque Sidearm from Containment are all also options. Moving now on to your heavy weapon. You're only going to need 2 types of heavy weapons throughout the entirety of this dungeon. For the first part of the dungeon, until you beat Gahlran, you're going to want to bring at least a decent sword. Now, this sword doesn't have to be super outlandish, it just needs to be decent enough so you can swing your sword and spam grenades at Gahlran. A falling guillotine is what I ended up using, but if you have a half-truths or an other half, that will do even better. For the rest of the dungeon, your other heavy weapon is going to be a decent LMG. Surprising, right? A decent LMG is going to carry you through all of the ad clear that is inside of this dungeon. From the second encounter with the 3 bosses, to Caiatl with all of the snipers and flamers in every room. Again, this LMG doesn't have to be super outlandish, it just has to be something that is decent. The one I ended up using in my run was a commemoration from Deepstone Crypt with Feeding Frenzy Rampage. Of course, you don't have to have that. You could use anything ranging from Archon's Thunder from Iron Banner, Fixed Odds from this dungeon, a fine Memorial from the Moon, or even the new Chain of Command ritual weapon. All of these with decent rolls are perfectly viable in the dungeon. Now that we've covered your subclass and your loadout, let's finish everything off and talk about what's going in our armor. And to start off, I want to make note that we'll be changing some mods as we go through the dungeon. I'll go a little bit more into depth when we're in the second half of the video, but for now, we'll just talk about the armor mods we'll be using at the beginning of the dungeon. And for starters, you're going to need at least 2 armor pieces solar and 1 armor piece arc. Starting off over at the helmet, I have mine as solar, and this is the first armor piece I recommend that you have solar, because we're not only using ashes to assets to gain bonus super energy from our fusion grenades, we're using explosive well maker. This is going to create a solar elemental well every single time we get kills with explosive damage. This goes for our fusion grenades, our ignitions, and even our Witherhoard because the puddle is considered explosive damage. We'll be using these solar wells in the build as one of our main resources since we're pairing it with a bunch of different mods. But moving on down to the arms, I have mine as solar, and this is one of the armor pieces you could have as any energy of your choosing. I'm personally using bountiful wells in it so that it doubles up on every well that I create whenever I create one, but you could use something like elemental ordnance to replace it. I'm also using Overload SMG rounds, even though that there aren't any champions inside of the normal version of Duality. The main reason we're using this is because it will reduce the damage that enemies deal to us whenever we proc Overload rounds on them. Moving on down to the chest piece, our Starfire Protocol. This is the armor piece that I recommend that you have arc the most because of the Armor of the Dying Star artifact mod. Similar to last season, this mod reduces damage taken from 2 damage sources for free. In this case, it's Solar and Void. So what we'll do is pair an arc resistance mod with it and take reduced damage from all 3 energy typings at the same time. Then the other reason that we have this piece as arc is so we can use the Lucent Blade mod. Lucent Blade's main purpose is to give us more charge rate on our sword while it's equipped. But if you ever decide to change any mods up in your build, like I talked about with the arms, you could put elemental charge in there and now use the damage bonus it provides you when you're charged with light. As the dungeon progresses though, we will be changing this mod out. Moving on down to the boots, this is the second armor piece that I recommend you have solar because we're using the mod Well of Life. Not only is it very cost efficient so we can use multiple different scavengers, but it allows us to have constant healing whenever we pick up a solar elemental well. This healing also can't be interrupted, just like restoration. This paired with really high resilience and restoration is going to give us that extra breathing room we really need when we're dealing with so many adds at once. However, if you feel like this mod is a little overkill for your build, you can trade it out for Bountiful Wells or any other well mod that you enjoy using. Finally, moving down to the class item, this is the one that can pretty much be any energy you want because we're using artifact mods in it. Classy Restoration is going to be the main mod and the star of the show. What it does is whenever you use your solar class ability, aka our Empowering Rift, it's going to give us constant uninterrupted healing. That healing is really going to bring the build together because it now lets us use our Empowering Rift without having to worry about our health. And if you remember from earlier, Starfire Protocol's perk is going to give us a free rift every single time we get a kill with our grenade. Meaning every time that we get a kill with our grenade, we can lay an Empowering Rift to then gain our grenades back and refresh Classy Restoration. For the other mod that we'll be using alongside it, it is going to be Solar Fulmination. All this does is increase the radius and the damage of our solar ignitions, meaning we're going to deal more single target damage in the long run and have an easier time spreading Scorch with Ember of Char. Now that we're done breaking down the entire build itself, we can finally move on to the second half of this video, which is me guiding you guys through each encounter. And for the very first part of the entire dungeon, which is I would like to call the jumping puzzle, there really isn't anything I can note here except for a skip that will help you save time. Once you've gone through a few of the Shadow Realms, you'll come to a room with 2 Centurions and you'll notice through the wall there will be a bell to ring on the left. As soon as you ring it, jump off the map and then jump all the way down to the bottom ledge where you'll skip an extra bell. And then from this point, you can pretty much just make it to the first boss. Now, when it comes to the first boss himself, the Nightmare of Gahlran, assuming you already know the fight, there are a bunch of tricks here that will help you out. The very first one is how you start the encounter itself. If you position yourself very far away from the bell at the top of the stairs, you can shoot it, immediately teleport to the Nightmare room, and lay either a fusion grenade or a Witherhorde shot where the other bell spawns. If you manage to time it well enough, you'll kill both of the flamers and unlock the bell to leave the Nightmare realm almost instantaneously. For tip number 2 inside of this boss fight, which is technically 2 tips in one, it's both how to extend the damage phase on Gahlran and deal as much damage as possible before you leave the Shadow Realm. What you want to do is the moment you enter the Shadow Realm to kill the 2 Scions, after you kill the first Scion, pick up the banner and move to the second one. Once you kill the second one, do not pick up its banner. The reason that you don't pick this up is because after you go back in to kill the clones of Gahlran, you can go and pick up that banner and a new Scion will spawn in that room. If you don't kill it and take the flag, you can leave the Nightmare realm, go back in, and kill it once you're killing the extra Shadow Gahlrans to go into damage phase. If you do this right, you'll end up having over a minute worth of time to deal damage. Which, speaking of damage phase, The way you're going to deal damage properly to Gahlran with this build is to lay your Well of Radiance practically on top of him, hit him with Wither Horde, throw your fusion grenade, and then start slapping him with your sword, transitioning back and forth between Wither Horde grenades and sword. If everything is done right, you'll easily take almost half of his entire HP bar in one run. Afterwards, you pretty much just rinse and repeat by going back to Trick 1. You move as far away as you can from the top stairs bell, and then you go into the Shadow Realm, repeating the process. If you do everything as I'm explaining it, it should take you about 2 to 3 damage phases to put him down. But if you ever feel like you're stressed in the damage phase, always remember that you can take your time. But after you've defeated Gahlran, this is where we're going to be changing up the build a little. We're going to be taking our sword off and then swapping over to our LMG. So make sure that you trade out your scavengers, your ammo finders if you're using them, or loading mods. We'll also be taking off Loosened Blade and trading out for a different mod. I personally like using Seeking Wells, but please feel free to change it out to whatever you're comfortable with. But moving on to the next encounter, which is the second jumping puzzle, there isn't really any tricks or any kind of movement tips I can give you guys for this part, but when you reach the room with the statues you have to rotate, there is a tip here I can give you. And that's if you look dead center in front of you when you enter the room, starting from the left, the statues are always in the same position that you have to rotate them. To save you a little bit of time, all you have to do is rotate them in this order: 2, 2, then 3. If you've done that right, you'll move on to the next encounter. And for this one, this is the triple boss encounter. When it comes to this encounter, I want to note if you're both not comfortable with this encounter because there is a lot of adds, or you don't have a solar weapon that can constantly refresh your restoration, you can just equip Healing Rift and play it safe. With just how many adds are inside of this room, there's always going to be an intense amount of pressure. As for the first tip I can give you guys inside of this encounter, it is how to track the symbols. Just like Gahlran, you're going to notice a theme where you're tracking symbols throughout the dungeon. Each one of them is going to be in each corner of the room, noted by the walls. Assuming you know how the encounter works, an easy way to just track them is to sprint in a circle around the outside of the room. You look at the 2 symbols that you need for that current boss, and then you hit the bell and go in, where we'll talk about tip number 2 for this fight. And that is to not go for more than 1 banner at once. I know it's a very simple tip that you can be given, but is the most realistic one that I can give you. You don't have a lot of time inside of the Nightmare Realm, and you don't want to waste or try to risk a lot of time getting more than 1 banner at each time. Even in my experience of running this dungeon a lot, when I went for 2 banners at a time, I would be coming out of the Nightmare Realm with sometimes even 3 to 2 seconds consistently. Any kind of slip up would just result in the run being over. However, I will say if you feel like you could push for 2 banners at a time, by all means, go for it. I just don't recommend it. For tip number 3 though, which again is 2 tips in 1, let's talk about how to efficiently go about getting these banners. And to start, the moment that you go inside of the Nightmare Realm and you figured out which one of the flags you want to pick up, you'll make your way to the stairs, and what I like to do is either throw a grenade or a Wither Horde at the first phalanx. Afterwards, I just start spraying LMG ammo at all of the phalanxes and enemies in the area. This is why I recommend that you have a decent LMG, because if it is decent enough, it'll make quick work of all of the adds that you're trying to kill to get your flag. After you cleaned out all of the enemies and killed the Colossus, you will start noticing a Nightmare Centurion is going to spawn. A super easy way to take care of him with this build is to immediately throw a fusion grenade right when he's about to spawn so that it'll instantly kill him. At the same time, another thing you can do is immediately shoot Wither Horde at the stairs behind you so you don't have to worry about the dogs coming at you when you pick up the banner. If you've done this right, you should have a lot of time to get out of the Nightmare Realm. Now for the final tip of this part of the dungeon, it's again how to DPS the boss when you come out for damage phase. You will have to do this 3 times, but with how long it takes you to get all of the banners, you'll have your super back every single time you come out to do so. What you are going to want to do though is when you get out of the Nightmare Realm and you lay that last flag you need to damage them, You'll try to get as close as you can, yet again like Gahlran, lay your Well of Radiance, hit them with Wither Horde, and start flinging grenades and spamming LMG ammo at the same time. Usually, throughout the entire duration of your Well of Radiance, you can completely kill each of the 3 bosses without any hassle if you do it right. But if you feel like you're missing a lot or you're not doing a high consistent amount of damage, don't panic, because you can take your time because their shields are always going to be permanently down. After you've done 3 cycles of this and killed all 3 bosses, you'll move on to the next encounter. And that encounter is Caiatl herself. I hate this boss fight. I absolutely despise this boss fight. It's ridiculously hard. This boss by far is the biggest run killer for all of your runs. I can't even count the amount of times I've failed my runs just to this fight. However, even though through all of the pain that is this fight, I do have a few tips that will save you guys a bunch of time and effort. And the very first one is how to manage the normal room with Caiatl herself. If you already noticed, there are 4 symbols scattered around the room just like the last 2 encounters. The first 2 in the front, which is Sun on the left and Axes on the right, are the only points where ads are going to spawn from. If you hang closer towards the back of the room, where both Cup on the right and Dog on the left are, you can hide behind the pillars there and really take your time. For tip number 2 that I recommend that you don't do, that is to throw your fusion grenades at any of the flamers near the middle of the room. If you see any of the flamers down in the middle of the room where the bell is, do not throw your fusion grenade at them, because when they explode, it will trigger onto the bell and send you into the Nightmare Realm immediately. As of right now, this is a known bug that Bungie is hopefully going to fix. I ended up wiping almost 5 times consistently to this one mechanic because I kept throwing my fusion grenades at the middle flamers. A much more safer tactic is to lay your Empowering Rift on the pillars behind the middle bell, and then just taking your time with whatever rapid fire weapon you have. Once you unlock all 3 of the bells inside of the room, you can start working towards going into the Nightmare Realm, where we'll talk about the next tip for this boss, which is how to get 2 banners in one go every single time you go in. Time is going to be a huge constraint in this fight. If you're familiar with the Nightmare Realm in this fight, there are going to be 4 flamers you have to kill to unlock your bell. If you've already figured out which of the 2 symbols you need to grab when you go in, you can keep track of where they are via the platforms before you head into the Nightmare Realm. What I personally like doing is jumping onto the platform where the first one starts, and then I'll keep track in my head where the other one is. Usually be right across, or it'll be next to me, or it's gonna be diagonally across from me. Once I've got that planned out in my head, I shoot the furthest bell from me. If I'm standing on the Sun platform, I'll shoot the bell closest towards Cup, and if that one's gone, I'll shoot the middle bell itself. This will spawn the flamers directly next to me instead of further away from me. Then from this point, I lay an Empowering Rift the moment I go in, Wither Horde the Scion that I'm on top of, pick up the banner, and throw a grenade immediately to the flamers to my right or left. Once I've done that, I jump off the platform and lay another Empowering Rift to refresh my restoration. From there, I collect the second Scion banner, I kill the rest of the flamers, and I leave the Shadow Realm with 2 flags on my back. Again, you don't have to do this. You can play it a lot safer where you're getting 1 flag every single run, but something to keep in mind is that this boss fight in particular is super unforgiving when you go to DPS phase. So if you really can push for 2 flags every single time you go into the Nightmare Realm, I strongly recommend it. Speaking of which, let's talk about DPS phase itself. This boss has some of the most unforgiving DPS phases I've ever ran into. You can waste up to like 8 minutes, 6 minutes, or even more just by getting to it for her to disappear because you got unlucky. A really solid tactic that I used in my runs to make sure that I can always stop her and do damage is when I'm about to go inside of the Nightmare Realm to do DPS, I'll trigger the giant bell to send me into DPS phase, and then I'll stand where the middle bell is. From there, I pull out my LMG and I get ready to kill the two flamers immediately in front of me. The moment that I kill them, I keep my eye on top of Caiatl, and I'm gonna watch if she moves either left, right, or down the middle. From that point, I'll figure out where she's trying to go. If she moves left, for example, I'll try to cut her off and throw a fusion grenade at the flamers next to her. If you can bait her with her stomp, you can stop her from going to the bell and take the time to kill the flamer ads. But from this point, now that the bell is open, let's talk about how to actually deal DPS to Caiatl with this build. And it's going to be very weird. This is a very weird boss fight with how you go about DPS. Since we're using Empowering Rifts with Classy Restoration, the goal in mind here is to use an Empowering Rift on the first and second bell, and then finish off with a Well of Radiance on the final bell while there are snipers hitting you at the same time. And you might be wondering, how are we going to get our Empowering Rift back to back like that when we're doing DPS? That's where it's going to get a little interesting, because you're going to use your first Empowering Rift as a placeholder for just bonus damage. If you recall, you haven't killed the other two flamers on the other side of the map. What you're going to do is, once you trigger the bell, you do a little bit of DPS with your Empowering Rift, and then you aim to get a fusion grenade kill on the flamers across from you when she's moving to another bell. If you do this right, you'll refresh your Empowering Rift and have it for the second bell. Something that I do want to keep in mind here also is you don't always have to aim for Empowering Rift well. You can just use the tactic of Empowering Rift, lay a Well of Radiance, and then use your Empowering Rift on the final bell. Both of these are going to give the exact same end result. It just matters a lot on your current positioning inside of the fight. Once you do complete the third bell and you get sent back to the normal realm, from this point, it's just going to be rinse and repeat until you take her down. From my experience of running this fight, it can take about 3 to 5 times going in and out of the Nightmare Realm just to take her down. But always feel free to take your time and don't stress about how much damage you're doing. As long as you are staying consistent and doing damage to her, her health bar is going down. Overall though, guys, that is it. That is going to be my solo flawless guide video for Duality on your Warlocks. This is without the longest video I've ever recorded and took me a couple days to do so. Please, if you have any questions about the build or the dungeon itself, feel free to leave it down in the comments, and if you have any recommendations for other players that you think will do better, also leave them down in the comments. It can really help out in the long run. If you enjoy this kind of content and you enjoy what I do, then the best way to support the channel is by giving this video a like and subscribing so you'll be up to date whenever a new build video goes out. I also stream all my Destiny 2 shenanigans and other games with my friends over at my Twitch, which will be down in the description. So if you have any questions that you want to ask me in person instead of here in the comment section, you have the access of doing so. Other than that, I really appreciate it if you made it this far in the video, and I'm going to catch you in the next one. Bye bye.